Hi, y'all. This is my second take recording this because I talked for way too long the first one, so we're going to try and talk fast this time. My research is called Of Athletes and Flags, International Sporting and the Russian-Ukrainian Conflict, as seen in figure skating, tennis, and soccer. So first of all, we have our table of contents here. Pretty standard. We've got an introduction, a lit review, a methodology section, analysis, and conclusion. Start us off in the research introduction. First of all, this entire research project is based off of the hypothesis from an article called Of Fighters and Flags, where they look into how the Russian-Ukrainian conflict has impacted the sports of boxing and kickboxing, with various athletes being banned simply for being Russian or Belarusian. My puzzle statement is what explains the varying degrees of inclusion and exclusion of athletes for the same political reasons and circumstances in different sports. So basic roadmap of the research. We're in the introduction right now. Hooray, that's a fifth of this thing. Then we have a literature review. We're going to talk about three conceptual groupings relating to historical memory, relating to nationalism, and other relating to other complementary factors and theoretical bases. After that, we move into methodology, where first we talk about case selection and all of my case selecting variables, because I couldn't just be normal and select a case. Then after that, we're going to talk a little bit about hypothesis testing variables, then the hypotheses and causal models, methods for data collection and data analysis, and evaluative standards. Then in the analysis, we're going to actually properly talk about hypothesis testing variables, as well as how each of those variables have impacted each case. Finally, we're going to do a conclusion. We're going to summarize main elements, connect to theoretical literature, and talk about implications for the future. So, literature review. There are three conceptual groupings, each with substantial amounts of literature. We've got relating to historical memory, relating to nationalism, and relating to other complementary factors and theoretical bases. Each of these have a lot of literature, like I said. When it comes to relating to historical memory, a lot of foundational literature in the realm of sports and politics intersecting base this on historical memory of the audience and the participants in this sport, and how everything is based in context, and context being the number one thing that causes these types of policy changes when things happen. That's not a good way of putting it, but we're just going to keep going. But that's what that does. It's almost entirely foundational. This is what people have been saying for years about politics and sports. When we get into relating to nationalism, that's where we bring in what Of Fighters and Flags starts to do, pointing out nationalism as a much bigger factor than previously thought in how that policy gets passed and what kinds of policy those are. And then finally, relating to other complementary factors and theoretical bases, this is kind of catch-all category for a little bit of everything else, because there are so many other small factors that impact sports and their reactions to political events other than nationalism and historical memory, but they're not big enough to warrant their own section of the literature review. So, research methodology. First of all, case selection and case selecting variables. When I first thought of possible cases to look at for this, I thought of figure skating, tennis, soccer, artistic swimming, and hockey. I don't know why I thought of these, but they're the ones I thought of, so they're the ones we're going to look at. And when it came to having control in these variables, I wanted them to first be popular domestically and globally, so popular within Russia and Belarus, but also have a very large global audience, because if a sport was primarily popular within Russia and Belarus, they're going to keep Russia and Belarus in. That's just common sense at that point. So they needed to be equally popular inside and outside. I also controlled for only sports where the international governing bodies chose to publicly condemn the actions of the Russian and Belarusian governments, purely because that was necessary in order for a policy to be had about the war that could then be researched properly. That was just completely necessary. For the third case selecting independent variable, there's a little mix of control and variation. I wanted to control for all of these sports being Olympic sports, primarily because in Of Fighters and Flags, the authors specifically talk about how boxing and kickboxing are very separate from the rest of the Olympic sports alongside other combat sports because of the element of private marketization that those sports employ. So they all needed to be Olympic sports. They all needed to be participating within recent times with little to no big scandals in who can participate and who can't, which is what eliminated hockey. I also did a little bit of variation in wanting a good mix of Winter Olympic sports and Summer Olympic sports. That was mostly coincidental, but there's that. And then in terms of variation, I wanted a good mix of athlete/duo sports and team sports, just to get a better grip of multiple different kinds of fandom cultures that could be impacted by this. And then I also chose to variation, whatever that is, for how dominant Russian and Belarusian athletes and teams are in a given sport. And case selecting BV, chosen or not chosen, I chose figure skating, tennis, and soccer because they best fit the various independent variables. Then moving into the hypothesis testing variables and their operationalizations, that's a hard word. First, for the DV, I wanted to look at the type of policy strategy employed. Are Russian athletes banned? Are they participating a little bit? Are they participating a lot, but with some certain restrictions? Are they participating unrestricted? What's going on there? For the first IV, current role of audience's historical memory, how much are people referencing everything that goes on to things that have happened decades ago, so ending around the 2000s? And then finally, second independent variable, the current role of audience's nationalistic sentiments. So how does the sport interact with nationalistic iconography and ideology? Hypotheses and causal models. The first one has both the historical memory and nationalism being important and driving to the policy together. Second hypothesis has the more traditional idea of you have high intensity of political memory, thus you're going to have a policy, but using the nationalism to be the intensifier that directs what that policy is rather than its creation in the first place. Methods for data collection and data analysis. I collected the dependent variable through the governing body's websites. They were in press releases, put them in a table, compared them. The first independent variable went through 3 different podcasts for each sport, picking a random episode and counting how many times and in what ways and for how long references were made to pre-2000s occurrences and people. And then something similar for nationalistic sentiments, where every time an athlete was interacting with some sort of nationalistic iconography, wrote that down, compared it, evaluative standards, lots of triangulation of data, making sure that things exist in multiple places and can be proved multiple times. Research analysis. Um, Jesus, I'm running out of time. So all of the audience's historical memory were deemed to be highly important. There were some variation a little bit in the ways in which historical memory was talked about, but they, for the most part, evened out to all be highly important. Current role of nationalistic ideology, very important in soccer. They're constantly wearing national uniforms the entire time they're on the pitch. There's, depending on the type of tournament or friendly that a match is, there may or may not be national anthems. Depending on how big the win is, there might be the national flag brought down for after game celebrations. I know at the World Cup, they bring in the main leader of the country to hand the cup to the winner. All sorts of fun stuff there. Figure skating, there's a lot of display of flags, both in the graphics and in person, and tennis has not much. So, yeah. And then for the types of policy, figure skating is relatively exclusive, with no Russians or Belarusian athletes allowed to participate in the main season currently, but they were allowed to participate at the Olympics under individual neutral athlete status, and are looking into possibly letting people under the age of 17 back into junior competitions. We're going to see how that goes. Tennis is relatively inclusive. If you're a Russian or Belarusian athlete, you can still participate. You just can't have your flag or your country code next to your name in brackets and scores. And soccer, highly exclusive. No Russian or Belarusian teams are currently recognized by UEFA or by FIFA, and will not be participating in the near future unless the war ends. That's the only contingent they've given. So that kind of took care of the case-by-case analysis, because I've got to have that slide. Implications and conclusions, main elements. I'm running out of time. Where am I? Jesus. I lost track of my notes there. Main elements, talking a lot about comparisons to fighters and flags, since I'm lifting their hypothesis and testing it on more sports. And looking through existing literature, doing a tiny little bit of historiography on that. Not much, but still a tiny bit. Connections to theoretical literature. This is entirely based off of fighters and flags. There's our theory right there. Not much else to be taken there. Implications for the future. There is a whole lot more to do. There are a whole lot more sports to test this on. There are a whole lot more political events to test this on. And there are going to be more whenever the future ends, in more crazy fun stuff for us to look into. Yippee, that's it. I hope you liked my slides. I had a lot of fun making them. They bring me joy.